everybody, and we were hoping we would get maybe like a minion, maybe like 10 or so people to come to our initial meeting. So I'm totally thrilled to see all of you here today, and thank you to Myrna, because Myrna came to me over the summer and said, you know, I really have this vision of making the temple a place where during the day we can have different groups going, and maybe like a current events kind of, you know, a monthly kind of program. So I said, I think that's an awesome idea, Myrna. You're in charge. So anybody should be forewarned if they come to me with an idea, you're in charge. So she's the one who gathered the committee together, and this is just really, really awesome. So I did speak. We had an idea for our next month's meeting to be the speaker to be our new state senator, Cindy Friedman, who I think is. I just spoke to her chief of staff earlier, and she is available. The date that I think November 13th. So she'll be our next speaker, and then we have a December program which is going to be Ellen Finkelman's son, Adam Mendelsohn, who wrote a book. He's a professor of Jewish history, and he wrote a book, Rags to Riches. Is that
the Rag Race?
Oh, the Rag Race. Close. So and each of these programs is going to include a delicious lunch, and thank you to everybody who made the lunch today. The Kugels, can you give everybody a? So what would a program be without food? Like that has to be, you know, an important part of it. So we'll have these delicious lunches and interesting speakers, and it'll be a time for just people to sit around and mingle and talk to each other, because we don't have enough opportunities to do that in the confines of the temple, which is what we're all about. We're all about bringing community together and learning. So we were trying to think of who we wanted to be our very first speaker, and I mentioned Chip Berlet. I always have him in my front pocket. As somebody, Chip, I've known Chip for decades now. He's a hidden gem in Burlington, and I've had him come to talk to our confirmation classes numerous times, and I didn't prepare anything, so I'm just talking off the top of my head. So if I say something wrong, just feel free to just shout out. Chip is an expert on cults and extremist groups, and he used to work for the Political Research Associates, and he's an internationally known expert. He just came back from a conference where he delivered a paper, and so he used to go to. He used to infiltrate these extremist groups and get to know, like, from the inside what was happening there, and then he's written books and papers, and he's one of the go-to people when something happens in our area with an extremist group. The media actually seeks him out to give the expert opinion on to help us analyze and understand what's happening. And I've also called on Chip a few times in recent years when we've had incidents of anti-Semitic graffiti and things in Bedford and Burlington and other places. I know I can always call on Chip, and I've had him meet with police chiefs and superintendents to just help to analyze, like, what do these symbols mean? Like, if a swastika is drawn in a certain way with other symbols, like what does that indicate, like which particular groups might that indicate are involved here. So he's really been an invaluable resource for our communities as well as for the temple, and I'm proud to call him a friend, and it's wonderful to have to be able to call on him for advice all the time. So with that, I would like to invite Chip to come on up and speak. Welcome.
Oh, the handoff. Some years ago, some decades ago, I was asked to write an article for a magazine called Schmata. And what do I know? I'm a Christian. I go, what's a schmata? I learned far too much. But it was about anti-Semitism in the Farm Belt. And the idea that why would farmers be angry at Jews in the 1970s? And that sort of caught my attention. I was working with the American Jewish Committee out of Chicago and some other folks around the Farm Belt, and it became obvious that there was a conscious attempt to organize desperate farmers and to blame Jews as being behind the collapse of the farm economy, which, you know, if you think about it, doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's when I first began to look at the dynamics by which groups are made the other and then blamed for everything that's wrong. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that has come up in the last 20 years. And a lot of you know of the work of Hannah Arendt and the work of the American Jewish Committee studying Nazism, the German form of fascism, and Gordon Alpert's work on Prejudice. And there's a lot of really great stuff in that, but there's been a renewed interest over the last 20 years in expanding on these ideas, and in some cases pushing back on some of the assumptions, which is always a startling thing to describe to people, because we get in our minds how this works, and it turns out that it's both simpler and more complicated. So I'm going to go through basically trying to explain in 20 minutes why there's a connection between right-wing populism, fascism, and anti-Semitism. Now, I write peer-reviewed scholarly articles, but I'm not an academic. I'm not a scholar in the sense of having a degree. But about 20 years ago, I was asked to start writing peer-review articles on these subjects. And I was just as the rabbi pointed out, just delivering a paper at the Carter Center, President Carter Center in Atlanta, about Islamophobia. So I don't just study anti-Semitism, I study Islamophobia, I study anti-black racism, I study kind of militant misogyny, which, as we all know, is very popular these days. And to give you an example of the kinds of weird studies I do, I ended up co-authoring the entry on neo-Nazism in the Encyclopedia Judaica. This was not a career path for me. It all led from looking at the Farm Belt and looking at how so many people who were otherwise sensible could look at the enemy being the Jew when there were so few in the Farm Belt, although there were Jews in the Farm Belt. So here's the bad news. The most recent scholarship on fascism, we'll start with that, is that fascism is a militant form of populism. And there's a Roger Griffin, a scholar of fascism, defines it as a revolutionary form of nationalism, welding together a dynamic national community. But the core myth, the storyline that inspires the project, is that only a populist trans-class movement of purifying, cathartic national rebirth can stem the tide of decadence. And so fascism then is a way of mobilizing people against a threat. And the threat doesn't have to be real at all. It can be completely imaginary. So there are real threats, there are imaginary threats. They have the same effect. And that's kind of a drag. But what do I mean when I talk about populism? Well, populism actually turns out, we heard about the People's Party in the 1800s. We now talk about right-wing populism. In the last few years, the work of Margaret Canavan on her book, cleverly called Populism, said there are all different kinds of populism. They can be forward-thinking, they can be backward-thinking, they can be progressive, they can be regressive. And she outlined a whole bunch of different kinds. And looking back at American history then, a bunch of scholars said, well, wait a minute, that means if this is the definition of populism, that it's a rhetorical style of an us versus them, that there are parasites above and parasites below, and they're squeezing us in the middle. So, you know, if you're the middle class, you're being squeezed by the parasites above, the corrupt elites. They can be Jews, or they can be bankers, or they can be lizard aliens, according to one English nutcase. And then there are parasites below who are picking our pockets. And in this country, they tend to be people of color, they tend to be immigrants. And so it's not just that you're worried about one set of parasites, it's that you're being caught in the middle in a vice. And in this vice, then, you are the beleaguered person who is being betrayed by people above and below you. So scapegoating is one of the aspects that we talk about when we're looking at this. So, you know, if in fact why you're disgruntled in your current life is being transferred to blame people above and below who are largely fictitious, it doesn't matter that it's fictitious, because you're angry, you're frustrated, you need somebody to blame, and then populism is a rhetorical style that can say, you're right, you're caught in this vice, and there are these others. So it's all about othering. And that remains the same process described in the post-World War II studies, that there's an other that's created on which all blame will be cast. But one of the things we now know is that if you blame another, and you use vilification or demonization or stories of betrayal or perfidy, that people who hear this rhetoric and think that they're the ones being beleaguered by these folks above and below, it paints targets on the backs of these people. And so one of the hardest things I've had to do in the last 10 years is to say, look, if people in power or respected people say over and over again, it's the blacks, it's the Muslims, it's the Mexicans, it's the Jews. It doesn't matter who's named by these people explaining the dilemma that people who feel frustrated and beleaguered, how that really is put together. There are always some people who will say, well, why don't we get them? Why don't we go get them? If they're the people causing this trouble, we can't really reach the people up above because they're powerful and they live behind gated communities or have guards. But we can certainly get rid of those people down below who are ripping us off. And so that's what happens, is that in this idea that there are parasites above and below, it's the parasites blamed below, the scapegoat others below, who are then victimized. And we see that now. Now, for years, I would argue with editors that this was true, and they would say, no, that's just a liberal myth. I go, well, you know, actually, this sort of goes back to these series that came out after World War II, and you know, was looking at how fascism worked, and they say, oh, fascism, you don't need to worry about fascism because that was World War II. It has nothing to do with anything. But then you get the development of these series that fascism is a form of right-wing populism. Well, what do we mean by that? It means it tells a story of this vice, and it is a very powerful story. But it includes a conspiracy theory. And the conspiracy theory is of subversion and betrayal. That the people above and the people below are betraying the real people. Well, begs the question, who are the real people? Well, the real people are the people who have identified themselves as the legitimate citizens in wherever you are, and that there are legitimate citizens, us, are being destroyed by the them above and below. So that's a storyline, it's a narrative. It is a way of describing a process in which there are good real people who are the real citizens and the bad people who really don't belong here. Now, obviously, in a relatively recent election, that was what the process was. The right-wing populist rhetoric of Trump, but mostly the people around him, because he really was kind of a bad student and he could mostly just parrot these ideas. But he is surrounded by people who understood this process so well that they could plant storylines through memes and tropes and little bits of information in the social media, and that this social media then carried this idea out into the public in ways that no one could have forecast. I mean, and there are a lot of people who said this might happen, but I don't know anyone who forecast that these memes of the other would travel so quickly and so deeply into our ideas. Now, conspiracism in America is nothing new. If you look at anti-Semitism, you can say, well, when did did anti-Semitism in serious political life in European culture really start? And we have debates. I worked with the Center for Millennial Studies at Boston University, and you go, well, was it the First Crusades, or was it really later, or was it the Middle Ages? A lot of really good studies about the development of modern anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages among Christians who were worried about the other. So it turns out that all of this stuff becomes this paradigm. But in the United States, while Jews are treated very badly in the United States, the kind of huge anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that you see in the 1920s isn't where it starts. It starts with a panic right here in Boston and other places against the Freemasons and their secret cult inside the Illuminati. There really was an Illuminati group. It was disbanded hundreds of years ago. But the storyline was that the Freemasons were sent to the United States to destroy democracy. And there was just a wave. There were people preaching in Massachusetts and up in Maine and off the coast of the eastern seaboard about how the Freemasons were coming. Then it turns into Catholics. So the next big wave of histrionic fear of a subversive other is the Catholics. And there are these books put out in the 1800s talking about how Catholics really can't be Americans because they have to obey everything the Pope says, and therefore they can't work in a democracy whatsoever. And there is actually stories, that the Catholics were digging a tunnel to Europe to bring the Pope over. None of these things make any sense. It's obviously not possible, but let's not go there. So what happens then is Henry Ford. How many people know what was in the glove compartment of every Ford sold in the United States in the early years of putting out the Model Ts and the later Fords? It was a copy of a tract about the protocols of the Elders of Zion. I swear to you. Anti-Semitic literature came with every Ford motor car. Henry Ford was the largest distributor of anti-Semitic literature in the United States in the early 20th century. In fact, it was such a big movement he started that Hitler gave him a medal for exposing the truth of the Jewish conspiracy. So this is hardly marginal in the United States in the early 20th century. This was a big thing. You could see relatively sensible publications talking about the Jewish menace. And that didn't really erode away till after World War II, although in the 30s and early 40s it sort of fell by the wayside, except for some Catholic anti-Semite radio people who spread the word for a long, long time. Part of this idea coming out of Christianity, but part of all of the beliefs of the children of Abraham. So if you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim, there is an apocalyptic or millenarian, roughly the same, but slightly different. But the idea that there will be a time when a Messiah will come. And we may not know when that will be. And being not sure of when that will be is good in a religion. You're sort of saying, well, there'll be a point when this will all come to fruition and history will end. But in the meantime, we've got to act good, right? Jesus is coming, look busy. Joking in my religion. So that the idea of a millennial belief is in and of itself not bad. You can be comedic, like I just was, or you can be tragic. Tragic millennial belief is the end is coming, history will be fulfilled, and there are these people who are going to stop it from happening, and we have to get them before they get us. Sounds familiar, this get them before they get us stuff? So tragic millenarian rhetoric is the idea that we have to act first in order to have history come to an end. This ties then into this whole idea of the storyline of the people above and below who are working against our best interests, especially in Christianity, where there's an idea that developed in the late 1800s that in the end times there were going to be, based on a very bizarre reading of the book of Revelation, which shouldn't have been in the Bible to begin with, because the guy who wrote it wasn't the guy who thought. That's a whole nother history of the Bible joke study. But So these people read the book of Revelation in my religion, Christianity, and they can say, so, someday Jesus will return. In the meantime, we're supposed to do good. You know, Isaiah 10, woe to those who pass unjust laws, who issue oppressive decrees to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people. Nothing wrong with that in any of the religions of Abraham. So that the idea then is, if you make your millennial belief root it in a threat of this vice of bad people above and below, then it's not just a storyline, but it's one that's tied to the either God or the absolute survival of you, the real people who are under threat. So why now? Why is all this happening now in our country? And it's because of a whole bunch of trends. Now, I worked for Political Research Associates now in Somerville for 30 years, started by Dr. Jean Hardesty. She was a political scientist who in 1978-79, we were in Chicago. My wife and I had moved there to do anti-racist organizing in the southwest side of Chicago, where there was race riots and attacks on black people moving into the neighborhood. That included fire bombings a couple blocks up from where we lived. There were a number of fire bombings. No black person had been allowed into the big central park in that area called Marquette Park ever. Martin Luther King tried to lead an open housing march into that neighborhood. He was hit with a stone and forced out. So that's where we thought, oh, let's move there and do anti-racist organizing. Well, it's a long story. But the first thing we learned was that there were race riots because these Nazis, all 12 of them in their uniforms, and they had a barracks with a swastika flag flying, would hold a rally, and they talk about who was threatening Marquette Park, the all-white enclave of Marquette Park, until some black families started to move in. And when I moved there, I thought it was the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, who were doing the violence. And what I quickly learned is that they would the neo-Nazis would hold a rally, and that night somebody would throw a firebomb or attack a black person. And well, who was doing this? And so after many years of being out-organized by Nazis, which is very embarrassing, to be out-organized by Nazis, we discovered that the rallies told a story of what needed to be done, okay? And the rhetoric told the story that heroes know what needs to be done. We know what needs to be done in this neighborhood, and maybe a few people will step up and do it. And that night, teenage boys would go out and do the acts themselves. So here you have this idea that rhetoric can lead, in fact, to actual violence. And it's that storyline that you're under threat, that you're being forced out, you're being displaced. There's a lot of studies now that talk about humiliation, being displaced, being dispossessed, being shoved aside. These are all the stories that people tell. Now, if you study Islamic terrorism, and Jessica Stern at Harvard does this, she's interviewed a bunch of the young Islamic terrorists, and they say they feel displaced, they feel humiliated, they're avenging something. It's the same language. So this idea of this other threatening you, and you need to stop them before they stop you, is central to this whole dynamic again. Why now? First, there's a well-funded network of right-wing institutions that talk about how important it is for America to have a kind of uber-libertarian kind of economic system and be run by white people, preferably white Christians. Along with this, we have a religious revitalization of conservative Christian evangelicals. Not all Christians are evangelicals. Not all evangelicals are fundamentalists. Not all Christians, evangelicals, and fundamentalists are like this, but there is about 15% of the population, perhaps 20, that believes that they're in a struggle with Satan. And who is Satan? Well, in the end times, according to their reading of the book of Revelation, Satan can be a trusted political or religious figure, because that's how they read the book of Revelation. So, what does this mean in real life terms? Well, middle of the Obama administration, Public Polling Associates did a survey of registered Republicans in New Jersey. And they said, do you think it's possible that President Obama might be the Antichrist named in the book of Revelation as leading this attack on true Christians. Roughly 14% said it was possible. Another 14% were positively sure of it. So that's 28% of registered Republicans during the Obama administration in New Jersey considered the possibility that our elected president was an agent of Satan trying to destroy Christian white America or just Christianity. It really depends on whether the people wove racism into that. But the racism, the white nationalism, the idea that people of color bring this subversive threat, it all gets woven together, and people can put it together in different kinds of ways. The economy isn't doing well, and we know that when there's economic contraction, some people become very angry and lash out at some other. A lot of this resentment towards people of color is couched in the rhetoric about taxes and welfare cheats. There's a story Ronald Reagan used to tell about the welfare mother driving with her food stamps in a Cadillac to buy liquor, none of which was possible and none of which was true. That never happened. It's a fictitious storyline to make you resent those people who are getting the dole and picking your pocket as a tax picker. How does this get put into mainstream Republican right rhetoric? Not all Republicans are like this. Well, Mitt Romney talked about the makers versus the takers. So who are the makers and who are the takers? Well, he said in a tape-recorded message, which was revealed without his knowledge, that basically it was the undeserving poor, the people who are this weight pulling us down, people picking our politics. And for a lot of people in the United States, this meant black people or Mexicans or other people of color. And so this has a name called producerism. There are the producers and the parasites. And so most political scientists and historians don't talk about producerism because it just seems so absurd. But if you divide the world, and in our country especially, into the people who are productive versus the parasites, and that then becomes racialized or gets tied to nativism or into something where we can create that us-them again, and there we have that vice once again, that there are the threatening, evil, subversive parasites up above and the lazy, sinful, subversive parasites down below. So who are the corrupt elite parasites? Anybody know who's on the list of the corrupt elite parasites? Why? It would be Jews. Jews are among the international bankers, the secret elites, the Illuminati, the Freemasons, the Committee of 300. I love that whole book about how they named 20, 30 years ago 300 people who ran America. Yeah, right. Globalists, godless, secular humanists, corrupt politicians, the trilateralists. There's a million people cast in the role of the elite subversives. Who are the lazy, sinful, subversive parasites? Well, let's see, blacks, people of color, welfare mothers, the undeserving poor, non-white immigrants. How about sinful? And these are all out of publications that I've read and collected over 30 years of studying this. The sinful are feminists, abortionists, homosexuals, and non-Christians. Okay, not all in one lump. I suppose you could be one person who is that, but that's not the point. The point is that in their mind, it's a sector. And who are the subversives? The people who bring subversive ideas into the country. Immigrants, social and economic justice activists, Muslims, labor and community organizers. Great. So there we have a great mix, and depending on who's in your neighborhood or who you think might be in your neighborhood, or who you just, when you wake up out of a dream and say, it must be the Muslims. It doesn't matter, because the reality is not as important as the narrative storyline about who is out to get you. Now, what are the tools that are used to get this to happen in a society? And over the years, it's gotten the original ideas about prejudice that Allport and others talked about, has sort of got diced into smaller and smaller parts and functions. So prejudice, bigotry, discrimination. Now, prejudice is an idea Discrimination is an act. So in the United States, the First Amendment guarantees you the right to be prejudiced. It does not guarantee you the right to be discriminatory and act out in ways often that are illegal or against policies that are inscribed. Discrimination if you refuse to rent your apartment to somebody who's black or Jewish. Dualism, the idea that the entire world's history is divided between the good and the bad. So you're either on the bus or off the bus. You're either, and usually that means, we're on the bus and we're throwing you under the bus. So denigration. Denigration, they're all alike. They're lazy, they love money. They eat this food that smells funny. I don't know. Scapegoating, they're good, we're bad. We're good, they're bad. They're causing all the thing. Then it gets interesting. Dehumanization. Well, what does that mean? Well, they don't love their children like we do. They don't have the same respect for things that we know. It's the idea that they're less than human, which of course allows us, if our other is less than human, then it says, well, some might be okay to get rid of them if they're not really. Vilification, that's kind of like a step up from the typical canards and oaths against people, but it's like they carry disease. They're rapists coming across the border. Vilification is a step up of the standard kind of denigration. Conspiracism I've talked about the conspiracy. Demonization, now this is especially big. And remember, we're talking about millions of Americans who are part of a certain subculture of Christian evangelicals and fundamentalists. But that if 28, something like 20% of the Republicans in New Jersey thought Obama was the Antichrist, it means they thought he was an active agent of Satan. That's what it means. So demonization means the person you've created as the other, the group you've created as the other, is not just bad, not just lazy, not just sinful, but they're actually active agents of a satanic force. And depending on your religion, you can look at that in different forms. And all of this comes across in a large society where there's mass media in terms of demagoguery. And demagoguery is what allows those memes and tropes to be carried on the internet, where these ideas are put forward in little information packets that might only be a picture or a few words, but create in our minds a whole wealth of ideas and images in our mind. It's scary stuff. Okay, Steve Bannon, great. Alt-right. What happened is that if you go back and you look all the way back to Reagan, there were people who were supporting Reagan not for the reasons that Republicans would normally support a conservative, but they were beginning to come into the Republican Party with these ideas of a threat of subversion. Okay, and part of that was economic, that big government leads to totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is Hitler and Stalin, so far true. But totalitarianism was not Obama. I mean, so if you saw those signs saying that Obama was both Hitler and Stalin, and we all thought those were pretty funny, except they thought that was true because they misread Hannah Arendt. So you actually have these people with signs based on the theories of Hannah Arendt about totalitarianism, which were accurate, that you see it on both the left and the right, but they then took into account theories of economists who said, and these are people like Hayek and von Mises, but a lot of other people, Milton Friedman, essentially that if you build a socialized form of government, even in terms of tax codes and insurance policies, that you're opening the door to big government, which leads to totalitarianism. Therefore, the first step at purifying and protecting America is getting rid of all of the social services that were implemented during the Roosevelt administration. If you don't think that's accurate, I can give you cites to the publications that are contemporary saying exactly that Roosevelt set us on the path of totalitarianism, and as government got bigger, the threat got bigger, and now if you saw the Boston Globe a couple days ago, the Koch brothers say tax reform is or else. That's what they mean. They think honestly, and they have hundreds of books that say this, that big government leads to totalitarianism, which leads to Hitler and Stalin, and so they take this seriously. And if you're a Christian evangelical who buys into this and this idea of the end times, it's not just it leads to Hitler and Stalin, it leads to the reign of the Antichrist. And when the Antichrist reigns, you're given the mark of the beast and you renounce Christ, and the entire historic understanding of Christ coming back, if you're a Christian, is out the window because you've now liquidated that possibility. Bannon knows this. He understands this. There's a lot of people in alt-right, which is a network. It's not a movement. It's not a social movement. It's not a political movement. It is a media network, but doesn't mean it doesn't have power. You can tweak with dog whistles this storyline to different audiences. So in one speech, you can use language that will be heard one way by apocalyptic Christian evangelicals, another way by white supremacists, another way by people concerned about their falling economic. In other words, you can package these things into little media snippets. And a lot of people don't hear one or the other, but it reaches a lot of audiences at the same time through metaphor. And what we're not ready for yet is to understand how these metaphors, which can be images or just little storylines or just packets of slogans, how this really works in a democracy, because you don't want censorship, so it's a mess. So where does that leave us? Well, so for a long time, I was caught up in a big discussion, and I get quoted in places like the London Guardian or the Forward calls me. And every time the Forward calls me, I always answer the phone by saying, "Something awful's just happened, and you're calling me." And they go, "Yeah, I know." But the point is that we are now in a moment of oscillation between democracy and something else. Now, it could just be a form of democracy in which only certain people count or who has access to voting. We know that tens of thousands of people have been eliminated from the voting pool in America through a variety of machinations, whether it's gerrymandering or simply cutting people out because they don't have the right ID form or whatever, or simply intimidating people at the polls. So when Trump was running for office, I thought, I actually know somebody in the Boston area who's the world's leading expert on the period in Germany before World War II, a guy named Professor Bookbinder. And I thought I'd call Professor Bookbinder, and I'd say, well, tell me about the Weimar period right before Hitler took power. Do you see any similarities? And I thought he'd say, well, there's these vague similarities. He goes, similarities? And he just bends my ear for like half an hour about how people in Weimar didn't understand the potential that things could go bad really fast. And I think that that's important. There's a guy named Peter Fritsche in Rehearsals for Fascism, Populism, and Political Mobilization in Weimar, Germany, many years ago wrote a book by going back and looking at who voted for Hitler in the last election. Before he took power. And the old storyline was that it was the working class, it was the old soldiers, it was a whole group of people were assumed to have voted for Hitler, but they didn't have computers when these studies were written. Peter Fritsche went back and did a computerized analysis of precincts, the equivalent of and what he discovered was that in the last election, so many people who were working class and unemployed had dropped down the economic ladder, and they were pretty angry. But the people who switched to vote for Hitler were the middle class people who thought they were next to fall. In other words, they hadn't lost their social or economic status yet, but they were afraid they could see what's coming. Now, that's exactly who voted for Donald Trump, and I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone, but that is the group that's the scariest because they have some power. They have some facility to work in political campaigns. They're not without resources, and they are being encouraged by the billionaires like the Koch brothers and others to get with the program of saying that if we don't stop this now, things are going to go bad. So Bookbinder basically says, right now, this is a quote from Bookbinder, and this is before Trump gets elected. Right now our society is facing some of the same tensions as seen in the Weimar Republic. People didn't take seriously the threat to democracy when they could have, and when they did see the dangers, it was too late. So in a Weimar moment, heroes know which villains to kill. History tells us that this can happen very fast. The violence has already started, as we know. History will record the outcome of our resistance to oppression, but history will judge us as to whether or not we stood up, spoke out, and resisted the white nationalism, authoritarianism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia of the current administration and his neo-fascist allies. Thank you.